So he's going to share some thoughts about his process, and he's kind of multi-talented. He teaches, he directs the gallery, and he finds time for his own artwork. Which is, sometimes, yeah, that's pretty challenging because teaching can be incredibly demanding, and running a museum gallery is very demanding as well. So we're really glad that he's come here and he's going to share some time with us.
Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate when people kind of come out and see my work, because when you look at what my work is made out of, it's all the stuff that you pass on the street, or the rock that you would take out of your garden and throw into the rock pile somewhere. It's the piece of rubber that's been by the road and run over several hundred times. And when I go by it, I go, that's pretty interesting. So the exhibition is loosely centered around kintsugi. And kintsugi is the Japanese way of repairing things that were broken. And in the repairing of them, they actually become more valuable than they were when they were first made. So the kintsugi technique, or the traditional kintsugi technique, is that you take like a broken teacup and you go through this process. You sand down the rough edges where the break's at. You fit it together, and you actually put lacquer, which is a tree-based resin, in between the cracks, and it's really starting off. It's really quite rough. And then you would put that lacquered piece in rice or on sand to kind of hold the mold of the piece together. And you would let it sit for a week.
Oh, wow.
And then you would take that thing and then you would sand everything else, sand it all down. Then you would refill it with another layer of lacquer. And then you would put it in the rice or the sand again for another week. And then finally, you get that and you sand it all down and put a very fine last coat on it. And then you would let it sit for another week. And then you would do your final sanding. And then you would put a very, very fine final layer of lacquer on there. And they would have gold that had been turned into a powder. And then they would like take a brush and press the gold into the powder.
Into the lacquer?
Into the lacquer.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, into the lacquer, the last final layer of lacquer. And then they let that last layer of lacquer dry, and then you had the finished piece. And it was, you know, you could still use it. It was, you know, waterproof, and everything could still be used. I, on the other hand, I have ADHD. The thought of leaving something for a week is anathema to me. So I don't do the traditional technique, even though I have all the materials to do the traditional techniques. What I actually do is I use modern day epoxies. So the longest I generally have to wait for something is about 24 hours, which to me is still way too long, but it's good enough. And because gold is so expensive, I often don't use actual gold leaf or gold powder. I use imitation gold leaf, and I put a lacquer kind of over it, and then so it keeps its shininess. Imitation gold leaf is essentially a copper alloy, and if you expose it to acids, it'll turn into like bronze looking or you know, copper that's been oxidized, which in itself has a kind of a beautiful look to it. So some of my pieces I don't lacquer just because of that. I want to see how they turn over the years, how it's like here it starts off shiny, and then it will transform into something else. So you have this relationship between the tarnishing and also the kind of pure, because some of the gold will still remain. The piece in the back made out of terracotta It's called a tasty dish. It has an image of a dodo bird on it. And the idea behind that was, of course, it was the human consumption of this dodo birds that drove it to extinction. So I'm playing with that idea of the gastrointestinal version of that with a tasty dish. So kind of dealing with human actions on nature. A dodo didn't have any exposure to humans, so humans could just walk up to them and like grab it by the neck and, you know, have a meal. And so sailors quickly found where that island was, and then they wiped out the dodo population. So my work, kind of building with this kintsugi idea, I have several pieces that play with kintsugi. I tend to not try to, on all surfaces, make it exactly pure and rounded. I like the hand of the artist being in it. All of my work deals with this idea of broken things. Life breaks us. Death, sickness, things that happen to us, traumas, things that happen to our loved ones. These broken pieces become very symbolic of, at first, the individual who's shattered. Probably a more applicable metaphor for my pieces, though, is that I take broken individual things and I place them together in community. So you have this community of brokenness that forms a wholeness of itself. And through all these broken peoples, you have something that I consider to be beautiful and aesthetic. So to me, that is very much a metaphor for the church. The church is a community of broken things that mysteriously and miraculously becomes, you know, the unspoiled bride of Christ.
Hallelujah.
And so if I can find the potential in these individual things that have been forgotten or that have been broken, and I can put them together in a community where they have a sense of wholeness, then the process is a redemptive process. And in the process of making these pieces, I'm actually very much aware of how my physical work is, in a way, a physical prayer. And that through the process of putting these together, I am connecting, or using today's sermon language, it is a way that I abide with Christ, or with the triune God, through contemplating what I'm doing as I'm actually doing it. And like you say, if you took any one of the little bits of the things that I have put together, they're junk. They really are. They're really not worth anything. I mean, I even use a Dremel that has a little sanding disc on it. And these sanding discs, they last for about 30 seconds of usefulness. And then, you know, the edges get all torn and white, and then if you work it really hard, it's on the spindle that's revolving at 15,000 revolutions per minute. And if it catches on something, it just rips off the spindle. But I actually saw these things and I'm like, wow, that's actually a beautiful thing in itself. And so I began using the actual sanding discs as the joints that would unite two individual pieces together. So you can see them on this small little tumbler over here. All the little round things on the side are these sanding discs, and they're actually become the structural part of the piece. They're literally the things that are holding the piece together. So there's that, to me, there's an interesting idea about how the thing that I use to make the piece actually becomes part of the piece as well. So it becomes a structural thing, but it also becomes part of the aesthetic because it becomes a visual design element in the pieces as well. So I tend to create a piece and then look at it and then come up with a title. Very rarely do I ever kind of conceive of what a piece will be and then make the piece. One exception in here is this piece on the wall, which is called Pieces of the True Cross. And this one actually appeared online in Christianity Today. And I had the rock, which is that round rock. And to me, that always had a sense of the stone in front of the tomb. And so that became the idea for this Pieces of the True Cross. And the conception of the piece is that as Christ's body was perfected, all the bits that it had picked up through the flagellation and the crown of thorns and the beatings, all those things that had embedded into his flesh, I kind of see them as remaining on the sepulcher. So all these little bits of things are reminiscent of things that could have been embedded in Christ's flesh and then left there at his resurrection. So that's one of the rare pieces that I actually had an idea, and then I made it happen. Mostly everything I just is very much like jazz. I start off with, say, a particular item that I think is really interesting, and then I look for how another piece might relate in shape or in contrast of texture to the piece I start with. So on the back wall, you see a gray piece that has like a piece of limestone on the left-hand side, and that one's called a dustbuster named Rocket. And the reason why it's called that is when I made the piece, my oldest son, Richie, said, "That looks like a dustbuster." So that's where the dustbuster came from. And that has an image transfer on it of a very early steam tractor called the Rocket. So playing with that image and also what my son said, there kind of comes the title. So that one has a heating element from my van in it. I've replaced it 3 times, and that's that kind of metal piece with all the holes in it. There's a piece of foam that my son found at the Mississippi Park, and my son said, "Here's a piece of foam, can you use it for your artwork?" And I said, "Absolutely." And it ended up in my artwork. That's got on the bottom right-hand side, there's a piston motor from a really cheap emergency air tire filler-upper. So I literally piece these things together with anything that I find that tends to relate to one another visually. So I was actually trained as a painter, and my first degree is in English literature. I had a really strong minor because I thought I was getting a double major, but I didn't know about it. I couldn't use one course to count for 2 different majors. So instead of staying an extra semester and spending, $7,000 to get the double major, I opted instead to graduate. I started my master's program in University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, and then had the opportunity to go to England to complete my master's in painting at the University of Leeds Bretton Hall College. And so I was all primed to be a painter and to teach painting at colleges and universities. I wanted to teach at a small Christian liberal arts college. God has different plans when you think that you're going to do something. I never thought I'd live in Alabama. I definitely didn't think I would ever live in Branson, Missouri. I used to work during college at my grandfather's heavy-duty tool manufacturing warehouse. And there's this old guy named Tony, and he's always would go in the summer with this bus trip from South Florida to Branson, Missouri. He'd come back and he'd tell me all about it. I go, man, I am never, ever going to go there. And so that's, of course, where God led me and Elena, and we've raised our family. We've been there for 20 years now. So I actually, after my graduate program, we moved back to the States, to Indiana, where my wife is from, and I started teaching adjunct at a couple of community colleges. And so I started taking all kinds of graphic design courses because I was teaching there, I could take whatever I wanted. So I took every graphic design course that they had in the course of a year and did an internship at Costco, which is stationed in Columbus, Indiana. And so I was doing graphic design, essentially. So I go to the College Art Association conference in Chicago. I leave my packets on this table called College of the Ozarks. And I'm interviewing with all these places with for painting positions and stuff like that. I got 3 job offers. I interviewed at 3 places. I got 2 job offers. Both of them were for graphic design. One was in Palm Beach Atlantic University in Florida, and one was at College of the Ozarks. And Palm Beach Atlantic would have been 30 miles from where I grew up. My parents lived in Florida still. And, but God, Elena and I felt like God was calling us to the College of the Ozarks. One of the reasons was, where would we want to raise our kids in? South Florida? Well, I've kind of been there, done that. Or the Ozarks. And it's definitely been the right place. So, all this kind of together is this idea that, we have our intentions for things, and sometimes when our plans get changed, we feel like those plans have been dashed in some way. But then, in retrospect, we can see how God used that insecurity and that pain to show you how more fulfilling your life is by following His path, as opposed to, thinking that, your plans that you had have been dashed. So I hope that all this kind of is reflected in the work that you see. I don't expect you to kind of look at it and go, oh, Jesus is here. My work, I think, definitely requires some explanation to kind of see the connection between how what I create is an outflowing of a relationship that I have with the Triune God. And so you don't have to be a believer to, I think, appreciate it for its aesthetic. But I think when you understand where it comes from, I think it has more meaning and is more fulfilling, especially to someone who is a fellow Christ follower.